It was happening. A shrill alarm shattered the silence. The night of September 26, 1983, had become suddenly and unbearably heavy in a Soviet command center buried deep in a dark forest south of Moscow. One man sat at his post in the bunker, his eyes fixed on the blinking screens. The deadliest warning known to man was flashing red in his face. One of the Soviet Union's most classified intelligence operations had brought him here. It was a warning so valuable, so secret, that he had no choice but to do one thing. Yet this man was no president, no dictator, not even a general, just a cog in an insane Soviet machine. And now, the power to destroy the world had fallen into his hands. Empires and ash heaps. From the moment he took office, the Reagan administration took an aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union, determined to curtail its strategic and global military power. This policy led to the largest peacetime military buildup in U.S. history and marked a dramatic escalation in Cold War rhetoric. Throughout the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan's administration made clear its intention to confront the Soviet Union on all fronts, both military and ideological. Reagan's rhetoric, which often depicted the Soviet Union as the evil empire, directly clashed with the Soviet leadership's own increasingly paranoid view of the United States. This growing tension manifested itself in a series of actions that pushed the superpowers to the brink of war. One of the key turning points in this escalating confrontation occurred on June 8, 1982, when President Reagan addressed the British House of Commons. In his speech, he declared, quote, "Freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history." The speech was part of Reagan's broader strategy to cast the Cold War as a battle between good and evil, portraying the U.S. and its allies as defenders of freedom against the tyranny of communism, a tyranny he saw as destined to be reduced to ashes. In response, Yuri Andropov, the sixth General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, said the Americans were constantly, quote, "inventing new plans on how to unleash a nuclear war in the best way, with the hope of winning it." The rhetoric also reinforced the perception within the Soviet leadership that Reagan was bent on pushing the U.S.-Soviet relationship into a new phase of direct confrontation. However, Reagan's military strategy would prove to be even more alarming to the Soviets. On March 23, 1983, Reagan unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile defense system intended to protect the U.S. from nuclear attack. The SDI was immediately dubbed Star Wars by the media, a reference to its high-tech, space-based nature. The initiative sought to render nuclear missiles obsolete by using ground-based and space-based systems to intercept them before they could strike U.S. territory. But to Soviet leaders, the SDI was seen as a direct challenge to nuclear parity. If the U.S. were to deploy an effective missile defense system, it would upset the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction that had deterred both sides from launching a nuclear strike. General Secretary Andropov, who had taken power after Leonid Brezhnev's passing in November 1982, was particularly alarmed by Reagan's plan. He denounced the SDI as an attempt to launch a new arms race. While the SDI was a significant provocation, NATO's planned deployment of Pershing II intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Western Europe caused even greater concern in Moscow. These missiles were intended to counter the Soviet RSD-10 Pioneer missiles stationed along the USSR's western borders. The Pershing II missiles were equipped with a highly accurate guidance system, allowing them to strike hardened targets, including underground missile silos and command centers. Their unprecedented precision meant that the Soviets could not rely on their traditional method of retaliation in the event of a strike. Furthermore, if launched from West Germany, the Pershing II could reach Soviet targets in as few as 4 minutes. For Soviet military planners, this meant the only way to defend against a Pershing II strike was through a preemptive attack. The Soviets viewed the aggressive rhetoric from the Reagan administration and the rapid deployment of new U.S. weapon systems as clear signs that Washington had abandoned the notion of nuclear deterrence in favor of a first strike strategy. Keeping a close watch. In response, the Soviet Union initiated one of the most extensive peacetime intelligence gathering operations in its history, Operation Ryan. The origins of Operation Ryan, which stands for Raketno-Yaderne Napadение, or nuclear missile attack, can be traced back to a secret meeting in May 1981, when top Soviet officials, including General Secretary Brezhnev and KGB Chairman Andropov, convened to discuss the growing nuclear threat from the United States. As a result, Andropov ordered the KGB and the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence, to begin monitoring every possible sign of an impending U.S. first strike. Their goal was to gather information that would allow the Soviet Union to launch a preemptive strike before the U.S. could act. A KGB report from 1981 stated they had, quote, implemented measures to strengthen intelligence work in order to prevent a possible sudden outbreak of war by the enemy. And that the KGB, quote, actively obtained information on military and strategic issues and the aggressive military and political plans of imperialism, as in the United States and its accomplices. Operation Ryan had KGB and GRU agents stationed all over the world, tasked with monitoring Western political and military figures, tracking individuals involved in nuclear weapons operations, and surveilling missile launch sites. Even the smallest deviation from routine, such as a shift in troop movements or the deployment of additional resources, was reported and treated as critical intelligence. Analysts scrutinized these reports, looking for patterns that might suggest preparations for a nuclear strike. Routine military actions, like training exercises or supply movements, were often interpreted as signs of escalating tensions, possibly pointing to an impending conflict. Despite the official explanations for Operation Ryan, Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer who later defected to the West, offered a more candid assessment. Gordievsky suggested that the operation was fueled not only by a rational assessment of the geopolitical situation, but also by a deep and irrational fear within the Soviet leadership. He noted the operation was motivated by, quote, a potentially lethal combination of Reaganite rhetoric and Soviet paranoia. He also described Brezhnev and Andropov, saying their mindsets, quote, were very, very old-fashioned and easily influenced by communist dogmas. Paranoia warfare. In addition to its intelligence operations, the United States was also engaged in a series of psychological operations, or PSYOPs, designed to exacerbate Soviet fears and test their defenses. Such operations during this period involved a series of high-stakes, provocative military maneuvers aimed to probe Soviet defenses and demonstrate NATO's ability to strike. U.S. bombers flew simulated attack runs towards Soviet airspace, deliberately approaching Soviet borders before veering off at the last second, keeping Soviet radar systems on high alert. NATO warships conducted frequent, unsettling maneuvers near Soviet naval bases, challenging the Soviet Union's naval response times and readiness. Meanwhile, U.S. submarines covertly entered Soviet-controlled waters, exploiting gaps in Soviet underwater detection systems, heightening the sense of vulnerability and fueling fears of an imminent Western strike. Dr. William Schneider, a former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Military Assistance, noted that these operations had a profound psychological effect on Soviet leadership, claiming, quote, it really got to them. They didn't know what it all meant. A squadron would fly straight at Soviet airspace, and other radars would light up, and units would go on alert. Then, at the last minute, the squadron would peel off and return home. These actions were meant to demonstrate the US's military reach and its ability to strike at Soviet targets with little warning. However, they also served to heighten Soviet paranoia, as each near incursion made the USSR believe that the US was probing for weaknesses ahead of a larger military action. For the Soviet Union, these operations felt like a direct challenge to their military preparedness. The constant strain of these near misses, coupled with the fear of a sudden attack, left Soviet leaders in a state of heightened readiness, on edge for any sign of impending war. What's more, as the US engaged in these psychological provocations, the Soviet Union became increasingly obsessed with the idea that history was repeating itself. They began viewing the escalating tensions with the West through the painful memory of the German invasion. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise attack that shattered the Soviet Union's defenses. The Germans quickly advanced across vast swaths of Soviet territory, catching the Red Army off guard and leading to catastrophic losses in both personnel and territory. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were lost, and key cities like Kyiv and Smolensk fell. The attack left deep psychological scars on Soviet leadership, making them hypervigilant about any signs of similar threats. Many in the Soviet leadership feared that the US might be gearing up for such an operation. Hair trigger. By early 1983, Operation Ryan had reached its peak, with KGB agents worldwide on high alert, looking for any signs that the US was preparing for war. The KGB and GRU sifted through intelligence reports, often misinterpreting or exaggerating details, further heightening the panic inside the Kremlin. In London, for example, Soviet agents reported unusual activity at Whitehall, interpreting it as a sign that the British government was preparing for war. In Washington, increased security around key government buildings was seen as another potential warning sign. Even the routine movements of American submarines and aircraft carriers were viewed with growing suspicion. Then, the growing paranoia reached a boiling point in September 1983, when the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian aircraft that had strayed into restricted Soviet airspace. The incident caused an international outcry, as all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman, perished. The U.S. condemned the attack as an atrocity, while the Soviet Union claimed it had acted in self-defense, believing the plane was a reconnaissance mission. For Andropov and the Soviet leadership, the downing of the aircraft was just another indication that the West was preparing for war. The incident further increased tensions between the two superpowers, bringing them to the brink of nuclear conflict. As the year progressed, tensions remained high. Cold War expert Bruce G. Blair said that the American-Soviet relationship at the time, quote, had deteriorated to the point where the Soviet Union as a system, not just the Kremlin, not just Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, not just the KGB, but as a system, was geared to expect an attack and to retaliate very quickly to it. It was on hair-trigger alert. It was very nervous and prone to mistakes and accidents. The Soviet Union remained on constant alert. The US and NATO, for their part, continued their military buildup, further exacerbating the fear of a surprise attack. Each side stood on the edge of war, and the specter of nuclear annihilation hung heavily over the world. A fateful hesitation. The night of September 26, 1983, was quiet inside the Serpukhov 15 bunker, a top-secret Soviet command center buried deep in a forest south of Moscow. The bunker's reinforced concrete walls were designed to endure both conventional attacks and the shockwaves of a nuclear blast. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of metal and machinery. Dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across rows of equipment. Monitors, radar screens, and communications consoles, all diligently tracking Soviet airspace and missile systems. The atmosphere was oppressive, suffocating even, punctuated only by the rumbling of cooling fans and the ceaseless beeping of alarms that heightened the sense of isolation. Amidst this oppressive mechanical chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his post, absorbed by the banks of blinking monitors and the constant hum of computer systems processing satellite data. After graduating from the Kyiv Military Aviation Engineering Academy in 1972, Petrov joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces. In the early 1970s, he was assigned to oversee a new early warning system designed to detect NATO ballistic missile attacks. The facility where Petrov was stationed housed the nerve center of the Soviet early warning network, designed to detect an incoming U.S. nuclear strike and trigger an immediate response. The system was codenamed OKO, which in Russian means eye, that organ which sees, observes, watches. His orders were clear. If the system registered a nuclear launch from the United States, he was to relay the alert up the chain of command. From there, the Soviet doctrine was unambiguous. Launch on warning. Any hesitation risked allowing enemy warheads to reach Soviet soil before retaliation could be ordered. So far, Petrov had not had much recourse to escalate any signal to his superiors and set the wheels of war in motion. But then, just past midnight, the streak was broken. A shrill alarm pierced the bunker, and Petrov's screen lit up with a stark, undeniable message. A ballistic missile launch from the United States had been detected. The warning was automatic, generated by OKO's satellites scanning the skies for the telltale infrared signature of rocket engines igniting. The system had locked onto an intercontinental ballistic missile, its trajectory aimed directly at the Soviet Union. The room tensed. Duty officers and technicians glanced at each other, waiting for Petrov's move. If this was real, the Soviet response had to be immediate. Every second counted. A report to High Command would set in motion the retaliatory strike, unleashing hundreds of Soviet warheads against U.S. targets. Petrov gripped the edge of his console, forcing himself to think clearly. The system had sounded the alarm, but something felt wrong. It was just one missile. One single missile. The United States had enough nuclear warheads to obliterate the Soviet Union. The first strike would not come in a single isolated launch. It would be massive, overwhelming, designed to cripple Soviet forces before they could react. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction dictated that no rational actor would commit to anything less. Petrov took a deep breath. The Oko system was relatively new. It had already raised concerns about reliability. Could this be a malfunction? Seconds stretched into an agonizing wait. The alert remained. The missile was still incoming, yet ground-based radar showed nothing. Soviet over-the-horizon radars, designed to confirm satellite reports once a missile crossed the horizon, detected no launch. No heat signature, no secondary confirmation. Just silence. Either their system had failed, or the world was seconds from war. If an actual missile was in flight, confirmation should have arrived by now. Petrov made his decision. This was a false alarm. He would not report it. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had just defied protocol. If he was wrong, if this was real, the Soviet Union was now sitting defenseless. Still, he braced himself for the next alert, waiting for the Oko system to escalate the warning. Time passed. Nothing happened. No nuclear explosion, no further alarms. For a second, his hesitation seemed justified. Then he felt his heart sink. The system detected another launch, then another and another. 4 additional missiles had been launched from the United States. The screen flashed red. The alarm blared louder. 5 missiles. This was no longer an isolated warning. The system was registering a coordinated strike. The room around him sprang to life. Technicians hurried to their positions. Officers scrambled to their phones, tension rippling through the bunker. If a U.S. attack was truly underway, the Soviet leadership needed to know immediately. Orders would be issued. Warheads would be launched. It was the scenario every man in this room had been trained for. But something still didn't add up. Petrov clenched his fist. He had no physical proof that the warnings were false. The satellite system was the only source of data. The land-based radars still showed nothing. What's more, 5 missiles were still not enough. A real first strike would mean hundreds. The Soviet leadership would never get a second chance at a counterattack. NATO war games had been growing more aggressive. The Cold War was at a peak. But why would the United States choose to initiate a war with such an ineffective attack? He had to make the call. Ignore the warnings. If he was wrong, Moscow would be incinerated within minutes. But the minutes passed. No impact. No secondary detection from Soviet radars on the following 4 missiles. The screens still showed an imminent strike, but everything else told him otherwise. Eventually, the alarm stopped. The crisis was over. No missiles had ever been launched. Investigations would reveal that the system had failed due to a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, confusing the satellite's infrared sensors. The Soviets would later adjust their protocols to cross-reference detections with geostationary satellites. But at that moment, inside the bunker, none of this had been known. Petrov had been alone, forced to make an impossible decision with the weight of nuclear war on his shoulders. If he had followed procedure, the world could have ended that night. Instead, he chose to disobey. Petrov faced intense questioning from his superiors following his decision to ignore the false missile warning. Initially, his actions were praised. General Yuri Votintsev, the commander of the Soviet Air Defense's missile defense units, was the first to hear Petrov's report. Votintsev acknowledged the decision as correct, and it was noted positively in official assessments. Petrov himself recalled that Votintsev even promised a reward for his quick thinking. However, the praise was tempered by a reprimand for not properly documenting the incident in the military diary, a formality that had to be observed, regardless of the circumstances. So, despite the early praise, Petrov never received any reward. According to Petrov, the lack of recognition was due to the embarrassment the incident caused among his superiors and the scientists responsible for the missile detection system. The system had malfunctioned, and if Petrov had been officially rewarded, it would have highlighted the system's flaws, putting those in charge in a compromising position. As a result, Petrov was reassigned to a less critical role and ultimately took early retirement. He was quick to clarify that he was not forced out of the military, as some Western accounts suggested. However, the strain of the experience contributed to a nervous breakdown, and the emotional toll was heavy. Disabling Archer. Of the close call, Bruce G. Blair remarked, quote, "The false alarm that happened on Petrov's watch could not have come at a more dangerous, intense phase in U.S.-Soviet relations." And yet, just 11 days after the missile warning incident, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a joint military exercise designed to simulate a response to a Soviet nuclear attack. Unlike previous drills, this exercise included elements specifically designed to confuse and disorient Soviet intelligence. The KGB quickly reported unusual military activity, which fueled growing paranoia in Moscow. Soviet leadership, already on high alert, feared the exercise could be a cover for a hidden NATO offensive. In response, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov mobilized military units, moved nuclear weapons, and prepared bombers with warheads. As tensions escalated, U.S. intelligence officers recognized the increasing risk, but chose not to raise their alert levels. They decided to wait and see how the situation would unfold. Eventually, the Soviets realized that the exercise was not a surprise attack, and they aborted their planned response. However, the events surrounding Able Archer 83 demonstrated just how fragile the Cold War balance was at the time. The uncertainty and misinterpretation of information almost pushed the superpowers to the brink of conflict. And so, as Able Archer came to a close in November 1983, Robert Gates, the Deputy Director for Intelligence during Able Archer 83, reflected, quote, "Information about the peculiar and remarkably skewed frame of mind of the Soviet leaders during those times that has emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union makes me think there's a good chance, with all the other events in 1983, that they really felt a NATO attack was at least possible, and that they took a number of measures to enhance their military readiness short of mobilization. I don't think the Soviets were crying wolf. They may not have believed a NATO attack was imminent in November 1983, but they did seem to believe that the situation was very dangerous. And U.S. intelligence had failed to grasp the true extent of their anxiety." Ronald Reagan, reflecting on the broader Cold War context, also shared his thoughts on the Soviet mindset in his memoirs. He wrote, quote, "Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy were genuinely afraid of America and Americans. Perhaps this shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. During my first years in Washington, I think many of us in the administration took it for granted that the Russians, like ourselves, considered it unthinkable that the United States would launch a first strike against them. But the more experience I had with Soviet leaders and other heads of state who knew them, the more I began to realize that many Soviet officials feared us, not only as adversaries, but as potential aggressors, who might hurl nuclear weapons at them in a first strike." The 1983 nuclear false alarm and Able Archer exposed the deep paranoia, poor communication, and readiness for war that defined the Cold War for both sides. Psychological pressure weighed heavily on all leaders, each haunted by the looming threat of nuclear annihilation. In the midst of it all, Petrov's courage to defy protocol and question the alarm became the critical moment that prevented catastrophe, demonstrating the power of individual judgment against a backdrop of Cold War tension and total nuclear annihilation.